So let's start with validating user input. For that, of course, we already got this validator function here. It's not doing anything meaningful right now, but I mentioned earlier that this is a special parameter that can be set on that text form field, which in the end wants a function that will be triggered by Flutter, by this form in the end, as you will soon see, to run some validation logic and return an error message if validation fails. Otherwise, this function should return null. So if it does return null, Flutter knows that validation succeeded and the entered value is correct. Otherwise, if we return some text here, this will be the error message and this will tell Flutter that validation failed and the entered value is invalid. So therefore here, in this validator function, we can work with that value, which will be provided by Flutter when this function here is executed. And this value here will be the value that's currently entered into this field. And we can then use a if check to check whether it's valid. For example, we can check if it's null. This is not the only check I want to perform though. Instead, I will add another check here, combined with the first check through the logical OR operator, so that even if this here is not true, so if the value is not null, we still perform the second condition. And my second condition here is whether value is empty, so not null, but an empty string. With that, we would make it into this if block if either the value is null or if value is empty. It's also worth knowing that if value is null, this second check won't even be performed by Dart because it already has one true value if value is null, and that is all it needs. If at least one of the conditions is true, we make it into the if block, so in that case the other conditions wouldn't even be evaluated. Of course, that's different when using the AND operator. Here all conditions must be met, and therefore all conditions will be evaluated. With OR, one matching condition is enough to skip the other conditions and make it into this if block. But even with those two conditions here, I don't have all the checks I want to have. I'll add another OR operator to add another condition, another check here. And you can add and combine as many conditions as you want. You can also combine OR and AND if you needed to, but here I'll stick to OR because I have a lot of alternative checks which I want to perform, and if one of them is true, I want to make it into this if block. Because my next check here is whether value, once trimmed, and you might recall that trim is a built-in method which you can execute on strings to remove excess whitespace at the beginning and end. So once the value is trimmed and we got rid of any excess whitespace, I want to check if the length is equal to 1. Because here, for example, I want to have input values, names, that are at least 2 characters long. So if the length is 1, I'm not happy with that. And actually we can check for smaller or equal than 1 to make sure that if the value after trimming it would have a length of 0, we also make it into this if block. And now there's one last condition I want to add here, and that is that value after trimmed has a length greater than 50. Because I want to have a max length of 50, which is also why I set this parameter, and indeed setting this parameter should ensure that you can't enter more than 50 characters, but still it doesn't hurt to also add this check here. And now I add the curly braces to define my if statement body, and will now only make it into this body here if at least one of these conditions is met. Now it's then in this body where I want to return my error message. And of course here I want to say something more meaningful, like for example must be between 1 and 50 characters long, or just characters. And otherwise, after this if statement, I want to return null. So this will execute if we don't make it into this if statement, because then we do indeed have a valid input value, and then I want to return null to tell Flutter that value is valid. If we make it into this if block here, we'll instead return this error message, and that will tell Flutter that something went wrong. Now with that, if you save that and force a reload, you will see that this has no effect though. If I enter something here and I delete it and this is empty and I, for example, click add item, I don't see this error message anywhere. Instead, we'll have to trigger this validation function here. We'll have to tell Flutter to trigger it, to be precise. And we'll do so in the next lecture. But before we go there, I want to copy this validator parameter and also add that to my other text form field, which is about entering a quantity. There I will add it as well, but here the checks will be different. Here I want to make sure that it's not null, or if it is null, I want to make it into this if statement and return an error message. And I want to check whether it's empty, but thereafter I'm not interested in the length, but instead here in the end I want to get a number. As a string, as you learned, it's always a string, but I want to treat it as a number and handle it as a number. And to do that, I'll add int try parse so that I try converting the entered value to a number. And if this is null, I also want to make it into this if check. Because try parse returns null if it fails to convert the string to a number. As you can, for example, see it here. This would not be a valid number, hence we get back null. So if we get back null, we know it's not a valid number, and in that case, I want to show an error. Alternatively, I also have a fourth condition where I want to parse this as well. And here I will know that parsing in general succeeded, because if it would have yielded null, Dart would have stopped after checking this condition, as mentioned earlier. So if this condition is evaluated, I know that it won't yield null, but here I want to make sure that it's not equal or smaller than 0, because the number which I get here must be a positive number. Now here Dart actually doesn't understand that this will never be null here because of this check, and hence we have to add an exclamation mark here to tell Dart that once this check is executed, this value won't possibly yield null, because otherwise we would have stopped after this check. Well, and that's all my checks here. If any of those conditions is met, I will return an error message, which here could be, must be a valid positive number. And that's the validation logic for this text form field. Now for the drop-down button, we could add a validator, but we actually won't need one. Because whilst we don't have an initial value here yet, we will soon add one, and thereafter it simply won't be possible to pick an invalid value, because only valid values are suggested and you need to pick one. So therefore here we don't really need a validator, we'll just have to make sure that later we do set an initial value. Which we can't do with initial value because this parameter doesn't exist here for drop-down button form field. But I'll get back to this later. Therefore, this is all the validation logic needed, and now it's time to make sure that this logic also gets executed.